Well, hi students, welcome. This morning we're talking about data literacy with my friend Kristin Fontichiaro. And Kristin and I have known each other for a number of years. We've met at conferences, worked on projects together. But I'm going to have her introduce herself. Kristin?
So, hi everybody. I teach at the School of Information at the University of Michigan, and I work across a bunch of different aspects, but I'm always looking at what does learning look like in both formal and informal settings, and how do we do it better? So I'm interested in maker spaces 1 day a week, and I'm interested in data literacy as a part of information literacy another part of the week. I'm just really fascinated by how we learn and how librarians take on that extra role as guiders or facilitators or teachers of learning.
Okay. And
so I'm excited to be here.
Well, thanks. And I know you were working on a grant and some publications and presentations around data literacy. Is that right?
Sure. So we are IMLS funded to do a 2-year project with a group of really great thinkers about how to fit data literacy into the work we do every day. So it would be great if everybody could take a statistics class for a semester, and that is not the reality that most school folks. Our grant is intentionally high school librarian focused, but we quickly realized there are a lot of people around high school librarians who also benefit from this. So we have sort of 3 prongs. One is we ask our team of curriculum experts to write materials. So we'll have 2 books that come out of this. One that really looks at how do you teach the nuts and bolts of data and statistical literacy? How do you unpack data in arguments? And how do you create and analyze, visualize data? Then last summer and this summer, coming up on July 20th and 21st, we have the 4T Data Literacy Conference, which is a 2-day free conference where we ask people who we really respect. So I think some of you have met Tasha Bergson-Michelson and Debbie Abelok of Noodle Tools, folks like that who are really at the top of their game, to tell us about how they use data with students. And then we take those webinars and we repackage them, which is what we're doing right now. And we make discussion questions so that if you get the data literacy bug and you want to have an hour of PD in your school or with your district librarians or with your public librarians, here's the webinar, and here are some of the sort of things that you might think about or do afterwards. So what we're trying to realize is that many people, including ourselves, did not grow up really looking at data. And there's sort of an old joke that librarians used to say to students, like, just skip the data when you read a scholarly article. And we started to sort of wonder, why are we telling students to read scholarly articles and then telling them to skip what for scientists is sometimes the more primary sourcey material? So it's very foundational. It's very much designed to give folks a leg up. And from there, you can decide how to get more sophisticated. So we're trying to build that bridge of just-in-time, high leverage and high leverage changes you can make in your practice, and then you can help your students make.
I'm really
That's the end.
That's great. So I'm planning to share these webinars with my students once they're out, and they'll be put in their playlists, and I'm very excited about that.
Excellent.
Something you alluded to that I think is really interesting, but I want to make sure we amplify it, is that data isn't just mathy. It is interdisciplinary, isn't it?
Right.
So even if you work with your math teachers, data is going to be really important anyway.
And most of the major curriculum documents at the national level mention data. Social studies talks particularly about how different types of those 3C standards, how different kinds of social scientists use different kinds of data. And I think one of the things that we found was really important is, if you think about how you did graphing in math class, at the bottom left-hand corner where they intersect is always 0, 0. If you look at graphs in the real world, they often don't start at 0. So you can go in, if you don't know any better, and say, oh, that's a graph like math class, and you react to it like math class, instead of saying, oh, that one might work a little differently. And that's an example, I think, of something we can do that's really small, that has a pretty big difference in how we interpret information. And that's really what we're excited about, is what are the small things that make the biggest difference in our professional capacity.
So as as we guide learners through looking at research, we're coming across different representations of data, aren't we?
Yep.
And then when a student encounters a data visualization or an infographic, what kinds of new skills would they need to read that?
I think so. In the case, let's start maybe with one visualization, because an infographic has lots of pieces.
Yeah.
We'd want people to be thinking about, where did the data come from and how was it collected? So some of us on Twitter last night were looking at how there's a new public policy poll out. And in the methodology, they say 80% of the respondents were by phone. And then the next note said, for those without a landline, 20% filled it out online. And I thought, well, does that mean that the 80% that took it on by phone took it on a landline? Because in that case, we expect people who are more established in their households, who tend to be older.
It skews.
So that would,
It
would skew the data. So where does data come from? And then we want to look at what could be influencing how I'm looking at that data. If there's a sort of famous upside down graph where actually the y-axis is flipped for the Florida Stand Your Ground law, had all the right citations at the bottom. We got this government data. So this must be a good thing, but the y-axis is upside down and the graph is colored red. So your first instinct is like, wow, since the Stand Your Ground law, murder's gone way down. What you realize is that red is giving you an emotional punch. And you also realize that, oh, it's upside down. Actually, the number of murders has gone up since that law. And so whether it's because people are novices at graph making or visualization making, lots of you work with students in middle and high school who work with infographics, so you know there's a lot of amateur visualization going on, or because there is a conscious manipulation of data, I think there's a really great opportunity for teens to dig into that, because I think it's really fun to figure out what's gone wrong and how people have been, how you can figure out what's true in something.
Okay, so what skills do students need? They should be skeptical of pretty much every piece of constructed information they encounter, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you've done so much work in this area. How do we make them skeptical without feeling like they can't believe in anything? I think politically we're in a very strange world right now, and I don't know that any of us have that balance just right. But what I'm excited is when we work with educators, how much we grow with a little bit of information, and how much more confident folks are, and how much braver they are to try something else. So I'm really excited that we're making progress, even if we don't quite know what that balance is.
So if we want to start, I mean, the data is all over the place, right? We have no...
Right.
But if we wanted to start introducing students to data as information sources, are there particular go-to places, like if we were building a guide for them or a Pathfinder? I would love to be able to, here are the top 5 spaces that you might go if you're researching something to get some data as well.
So all of us have different favorite sites. So some on the team really like data.gov. Mm-hmm. Which was a pretty ambitious project of the past administration with MIT, I think, to say, we're going to make a site that links to all of the government data that's out there. And that can be a good place to go when you don't know where to go, because historically we find that government data is pretty reliable. But it's not necessarily well curated. Information might not be online in standard or systematized ways. So it's still a work in progress. I think a really great place for students to start looking is with census data at census.gov. Mm-hmm. You can look up your census tract. You can look up your zip code or your community and see what the data has to say about that. Social Explorer, which has a free online version and a subscription version, is a really great way to map a lot of that census data. And I think mapping and visualizing in that way, you really get to the fact that visualization is supposed to deliver some insight or aha to you. It's not to make something colorful and pretty. And so it's a good way, I think, to focus students on really good data. Oh, I'm gonna hang up and remember some
No,
more.
that's okay. You know what? I'll create a list that we'll put underneath this so that people will see it.
That would be great.
Another thing, as we were talking, you were talking about arguing with data, making a point. Is that something? I mean, we often ask our students to grab quotes. That's our evidence. But we should also be asking students on a regular basis to use data as evidence for an argument. Is that right?
I would say absolutely. And also to look, so two things: how do I make my point by supporting it with data? And how do I look at how other people are using data and make a decision? So one example that Debbie Ablock brought to the table was during the election, there are many ways to measure the unemployment rate. You can measure, according to the government definition, those who want a job that don't have a job, and that's around 5%. You can also look at every adult that doesn't have a job, which includes those who want to be employed, but also retirees, students who we expect not to be full-time employed. And then the number goes up into the 20s. During the election was that there was a real resonance when someone used that much bigger number. And in poor communities where unemployment rates are high, that seemed real, and 4.7% did not seem real. And that was a case where both pieces of data were legitimate, but stripped away from context, they started to look like equivalencies. And I think it's important that we start asking ourselves those kinds of questions. So I live in Ann Arbor, and we have a very high employment rate here. I have a cottage up north where the unemployment rate is 50%. So in my Ann Arbor world, I believe the 4.7% unemployment rate. Up north, the census data tells me it's 50%. No wonder they believe the more grim argument.
Are those folks retired?
Many actually, yeah, Michigan's a very interesting state because a lot of the mid-state retirement resort communities, so we are a lake state, are populated by retired union workers. And so there's a very interesting sense of how the world has changed dramatically and not for the better for those folks. Mm-hmm. And so they are living a life where they had a dream that's no longer playing out as well as they wanted. And I think it's important for us to realize that some data is meant to be manipulative, and some data we can just make mistakes and be naive about. But there are real world consequences for that.
So if you were building a data literate student, I don't know if you have your own kind of checklist. What would that student look like?
So I want students to be able to see numbers and be able to make sense of those numbers. So one level is just the comprehension level. So we all read this wonderful book called Stat Spotting by Joel Best, who's a professor at Colorado. And one of the things I would want students to know I got from him, which is that you should have a general sense of, like, is this a big number? And he gives us an example that if you know the population of the US, you're going to be able to compare a ton of stuff to that. And the population clock for the census currently says we're just shy of 325 million people. The birth rate's about 6 million people a year, 6 million babies, which means there are about 6 million first graders and about 6 million kids graduating from high school. When you see data like that, when you see new numbers and you can compare them to that, you suddenly gain some ability to process new information in powerful ways. So when I saw that the National Education Association endorsed Clinton and there are 3 million people in that union, that's 1% of the whole US. If I also knew what the voting population was, which I don't know offhand, I could quickly make a comparison to see how significant is that endorsement. So I want them to be able to answer questions like, is that a big number? I want them to be able to look at graphs and charts, and with graphs, look for the y-axis. Know how to sort of deconstruct and look for critical elements. We're seeing an explosion of pie charts where the parts add up to more than 100%, which a pie chart shouldn't. And so part of what we're seeing is sort of the aesthetics of data are really hot right now. Anybody can make something and anybody can make it look great, but it doesn't mean they have sort of the data background to do it correctly. And I would want them to be able to ask questions about, where did that data come from? Can I compare this data to that data? And kids deal with data every day. They can handle this. They understand what RBIs are and what batting averages are, and many other sports stats that I can't list right now. So I think they have the capability. And I think what excites me about data and about deconstructing it is that there are these sort of hidden messages. I think it sort of fits with how teens are sort of skeptical of adults anyway. So those are sort of the big things for me. And that's why in our first year, those were our big things that we really worked on, is how do we lay those foundations? Given that when we did some research, most librarians don't take a course in research methods. Most librarians come from humanities backgrounds. Some of us intentionally avoided taking some of this in school. I think I took dinosaurs and other failures to get my science credit. There was no data there.
That's a great title.
So, but I graduated. So how do we sort of make up for lost time?
Yeah.
So we can be in that zone.
But it is really hard to avoid data, isn't it? I think it's
oh, completely.
Right. It's we could go to data sets in the major and well-respected sources that you mentioned, but when was it, in the early 80s, that USA Today started putting a little data chart on the bottom left of below the fold every single day?
Right.
And then we hit these data visualizations in the New York Times Online, the Washington Post. Data is really pervasive, and it often gives us, if we don't want to read an entire article, it gives us that immediate hit of a piece of information.
Exactly.
And we don't take it time to really study that sometimes.
In fact, Jen Colby, in her work on this project, she's a high school librarian here in Ann Arbor, suggests that in some cases we should start with data. We should start with an infographic or a graph or a pie chart, because that sort of visual concreteness can help ground you, so then you can go and build on it with text-based information. And I'm really excited about that possibility.
Yeah,
because I think it flips things in exciting ways.
So when we talk about literacy, we talk about both reading and writing, of course. Right. And so in terms of AASL's big four things, in terms of creating, think, create, share, and grow, should students begin creating with data? And what might be first step projects for them?
To create with data?
Yeah.
Okay, I just tuned out for a second. I think there are a couple of things. Clearly, what we found in our research when we had folks register for the conference is that teachers and educators in general are really interested in infographics and making infographics. And we think that's a really sort of strange grassroots thing, because that isn't part of curriculum standards anywhere. So people are contextualizing, how do I make better infographics? That's why I need to know about data. So I would say that's a common place to start, but it's a very complex way to begin, because it's essentially a whole bunch of visualizations. And I think it's really hard to have students create sort of an argument or a cohesive thesis in an infographic without it looking like we used to say about PowerPoint slides, one fact here, one fact there, right?
What I
don't all really
when I started with that, it occurred to me that the first time I did that and I wrote about that, I was doing it all wrong. What I needed for this was a team of students with different specialties. And so I needed somebody who could organize an argument really well. And I actually didn't tell the students I was doing this. So I needed my person who had the logic and could structure an argument. I needed the person who had this intimate kind of grasp of design, who knew what colors meant, who knew that they could play with font, who knew they could search for palettes, and who knew the impact of big and small on a page and where things should go. I needed a mathematician, somebody who could crunch the numbers once they were gathered in meaningful ways. I needed somebody who had also a persuasive kind of, here's the point we're trying to make. Because it wasn't like, infographics are not necessarily neutral. In fact, I see
Right.
them as highly
Almost never are.
arguments. And so where are we going with this, and how do we make our argument? And then you needed somebody who could like herd the cats together. But before that, when I just allowed like 5 friends who happened to be girls and happened to be very chatty to get together and make an infographic, the thing didn't move. But seeing the various different talents and putting them together was important. So you're right. It's a complex task.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've seen any of the presentations Connie Williams and Debbie Abelok have done about infographics.
No, I haven't recently. They did
a webinar maybe a year ago for, I think, InfoHio about infographics. That's completely worth seeing. And then they've sort of worked on that. We have a really long webinar. We did a double session about this with Sue Smith, and then Connie wrote about it for the forthcoming book. And one of the things that Connie realized was that the temptation, because the need to make infographics tends to come from an ed tech need, she realized that when the software is there, you're just going to sort of plug and play. Like we used to talk about cut and paste for PowerPoint, right? And we would get these sort of episodic slide decks that didn't come together with any kind of thesis. And she started, she calls it story framing. She now has kids actually sticky note it on paper and move things around. And she says it's transformed the quality of the arguments in her infographics. So slowing down and realizing the point is not the tool, the point is not the topic, the point is how we build these arguments. Her work is just stupendous in that area. And she and Debbie have also written about that for Knowledge Quest. So there's a little trail going along. And we actually, we have someone on our staff who is going to do some follow-up work about this infographics phenomenon in the survey. And she did a literature search of how are we talking about infographics in school? And she said she just kept running into article after article of how to. And she said, but I found these 2 things that actually talked about building arguments. And we looked at the authors and they were both on our project. So we think there's a real need to make that information more mainstream. Right? We want kids who are great thinkers, not great clickers.
We did a preliminary activity where we brought an infographic into ThingLink, and we had students annotate where they thought the argument was, where the persuasive elements were. We had them annotate the sources too, because very often the sources will be non-existent or very tiny in the bottom, and they'll just be URLs, and you won't really know what the source actually is. And we thought that was intentional. So annotating the infographic from a really critical way, from a critical perspective, really got them thinking about what they were reading in these pieces. And then, each week I get an infographic that is being pitched to me by a company that says, will you share this infographic in your blog? It's really excellent. It's on a topic you cover. But who is the source of this and why are they producing it is something that I'm always thinking about.
I totally agree. I'm noticing my phone is running out of juice.
Well, okay.
The charger's not working.
No. Okay. Well, why don't we, before you run out of juice, how about this has been a really great conversation so far, but how about we offer you the final words about like what you think are the most important takeaways as we prepare these our very dear pre-service librarians to work with young people in libraries, and also how they might contact you afterwards.
So a couple of things. One is this year we're looking really at things that are really sort of data in kids' lives. So we're looking at, where does your Fitbit data go? Who's in charge of it? Who owns it? What happens if it's sold? What does it mean to like something on Facebook? Where does that go? Why does that matter? There have been interesting lawsuits with personal data devices. So we're going to look at that. We're looking at big data, the good, the bad, the ugly. And by extension, the citizen science movement and how you can contribute to large data sets. in ways that are for the social good, which I think is, so as we're taping this, the president's initial budget proposal in March 2017 has come out. We're seeing significant cuts to science, to the environment. I'm from the Great Lakes state. Those things really matter to us. So I think citizen science is going to have a bigger role moving forward. And we're also looking at ethical data use. So start by being more mindful of where are kids interacting with data, and where do you see that you yourself are struggling with data. And I think that's part of what will make for you that mindfulness. For me, I clearly remember Debbie Abelak saying this data thing's going to be a big deal, and I said I don't like data and I don't want to do that. And as I started tuning in, I started to see what a big deal it is. And I think when it's your own journey, then you're much more passionate and excited about it than when it's, I mean, we're going to prepare all these materials, we hope you use them. But what's more powerful is when you take that journey on yourself. And when kids see that you're excited about it, I think that they at least take a better look at, why are you caring about this? And we stand a better chance of building those skills up.
Well, you've made the case with me, and I'm sure you will make a compelling case when I share this with my students. And how should students follow your project and you yourself, Kristin?
Sure. So our project is at dataliteracy.si.umich.edu. Our conference is coming up July 20th and 21st online. You can come and go for the parts that are of interest to you, and registration isn't quite open yet. But you can, on that site, there's a place that says add us to your email list, and we'll let you know that we have when we have that decided. And on Twitter, I'm Active Learning, and my email address is font, F-O-N-T, @umich.edu.
Kristin, I'm going to stop the broadcast now. I'm very, very grateful for your wisdom and your time, and I know you will inspire my students to learn more about and work with young people and data. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Joyce.